I do have to make a few plugs for some of our fun upcoming events here. By the way, I'm Belle Morian. I'm our programming director here at the museum. Our SOAR Family Day event will be Sunday, March 2nd from 11 to 3 with great live music, delightful butterflies, bikes to ride, exotic bugs to hold from the Museum of Natural Science in Houston, tons of fun, family, friends, and hands-on activities, food trucks, and tons more. And we hope you join us for the day. There's no charge for that day. It's a lot of fun. During Saturdays in March, we're going to have a very talented pianist in the house playing the piano in the music room during tours, and it's a real special experience, so we hope you'll come enjoy that. Friday, March 28th, will be music with the McFaddins, and it's an evening on the lawn with string benders from Houston. And they play some really great classic rock, classic country, and with a little bit of Zydeco thrown in, so that will be a fun evening. And then on Thursday, April 10th, back by popular demand, we'll have Bob Whitman here. He's a former FBI agent, and he'll return to the museum for an intriguing lecture on frauds, forgeries, and fakes in the art world. And our last lecture for the season will feature Matt Anderson from the Henry Ford Museum with a lecture on Wheels of Progress. And the really cool thing, that's when it's going to be so much fun because we're out in the parking lot. We're going to have a big display of antique cars, really special antique cars. So that will be a great lecture too. So I hope you will join us for the events. They are admission free and graciously underwritten by the Mamie McFaddin-Ward Heritage Foundation and supported by Humanities Texas, which is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for Humanities. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our board president right here, is Leslie Wilson. And then we also have Ida Pyle right here. Wave, Ida. So we're thrilled and honored to have you here. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our intrepid speaker who has braved snow, sleet, and rain to get here tonight. Danny Michael is the curator of the Cody Firearms Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody, Wyoming. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West is an affiliate of I can't talk. I'm just so sorry. The Smithsonian Institution, and is comprised of 5 museums, including the Cody Firearms Museum, which is named after Buffalo Bill Cody. Danny serves as curator and oversees the most comprehensive collection of American firearms in the world, containing over 7,000 firearms and 30,000 firearms-related artifacts. That's a lot to keep track of. Danny holds a master's degree in public history and has appeared on the Outdoor and Sportsman channels featuring historic firearms. The history of the American frontier was significantly influenced by the innovations in firearms. So, forgive me, I have to say this. Here's the story, lock, stock, and barrel, straight from the shooter. Please welcome Danny Michael.
I normally have to do that adjustment for most things. Well, thank you very much, Belle, and thank you to Belle and Sarah and everybody here at the McFaddin-Ward House. It's a real privilege to be with you, and you all please say something nice to Belle and Sarah on your way out. They worked really hard to get me here. They put up with my bad email habits, in working on here, and they put up with a lot of panic on Tuesday when we didn't think it was going to happen. And they worked it out, and they worked really hard to get me here. And I'm just really appreciative for their invitation and all that they've done to make this event happen and to bring me down and have me and to do this program. And it's very clear that you have a really wonderful group of staff who are passionate about and sharing your local history. So, like I said, go say something nice to them because they've been through it this week. As Belle said, I'm going to be talking about firearms of the American West. I am from the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and the Cody Firearms Museum, where we do, as she read, have 7,000 firearms in our collection at any given time. About 4,000 of those are on display. We have firearms that are as old as the 1400s and as new as last year. We collect the scope of firearms history as much as we can. For those that don't know, we got our start as the Winchester Arms Collection. When Winchester decided that they were busy running a company and didn't necessarily want to run a museum at the same time, they ended up deciding to move the collection to Cody, Wyoming, to the then Buffalo Bill Historic Center, where it became the Winchester Arms Museum. And then when they donated the collection, we changed that to the Cody Firearms Museum and began interpreting a wide range of firearms history. Of course, people know us best as a museum about Western firearms because we're in Wyoming, it's in the title, it's Buffalo Bill, so you can expect to see some Western guns, and that's what I'm here to talk to you tonight about. But before I get too far, and actually, while I'm saying this poster image that I use as the title, I think captures what we think of when we talk about firearms of the West. That classic train hold-up, stagecoach robbery kind of situation. And tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit about those typical firearms of the West, and then some atypical, some unexpected ones, and looking at the wide picture of firearms and how they were used in the American West. But with any good firearms lecture,
Just on the side, click it on. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I think
right.
I forgot to do that.
I did this exact thing at a presentation like last week. Anyways, with any good firearms presentation, this is what Cody looked like yesterday. So the image over here is the heavy machinery that we typically use to clear our main street. That's my commute to work Tuesday morning when I was supposed to fly out on Wednesday morning. And that was the start of another snowstorm. And then this was our parking lot at the museum yesterday, and that snowbank right there is about car height. It's not quite as tall as that Suburban right there, but it's about car height. So it was really rough, and I expected, when I said I'd do this lecture, I was thinking, Texas in February, that doesn't sound too bad. It sounds a little warmer than Cody. And I thought my phone was broke when I landed at Houston today because it said 28, and that couldn't be right. But there we were. So winter weather in the West. So like I said, we start off and we think about the guns we picture in the American West. There's the stagecoach, the train robbery, the high noon shootout kind of guns. And the guns we picture are a lot like this. This is a Winchester 1873. Actually, a couple of folks, or one of you brought that with me for me to look at just while we were doing the ID clinic out there. And a Colt single action army. We saw a couple of those too. Those are the guns, the Winchesters and the Colts. Every movie, the cowboy's wearing a 6-shooter. Most of the movies, he's got a lever action rifle. And if you look closely at the details in those movies, it's usually one of these two or a very close approximation of those two. And that also lends a reason we think that. When Buffalo Bill starts portraying the American West, he starts retelling some of these stories that he's experienced. Those get put into dime novels. Other Western figures get their stories retold as novels. The novelists tend to embellish quite a bit on those stories. And then the movies pick them up and they embellish a little more. And suddenly we get, this classic, 20th century Western and a movie like Winchester 73 where the rifle is actually the star of the show. And it's got to be a Winchester 73. And so that informs a lot of what we think. Just as pop culture informs a lot of what we think about the past in any given topic, that's also true for the firearms. So we think a lot about that because we see it a lot. That was what was on screen, and there's some truth to it. It's not just all made up. There's some truth to Winchesters and Colt in the West. But we start to look beyond that. So how do we study this? How do I, as a historian, start to learn a little bit more about what was actually in the American West? So we have things like surviving firearms. Some of the guns up here, some of the guns that you brought are those classic Western arms that have connections and ties to the American West. So we get to learn something from the primary source, which is the firearm itself. We see photographs like this one. Some rough looking dudes right there. And pay attention to this photo. If any of you figure out why I picked this photo and why I'm going to talk about it later, I'll be really, really impressed. I don't have anything to give you, I'll just be impressed. But we have photos, so we can see there are very specific firearms in a period photo taken in the American West. Why are those guns there? And that tells us about the firearms. We have written accounts and military records. People write down what they were doing. They tell a hunting story. They tell a military story. Talk about a battle, maybe an animal they hunted. And they write something about the firearm. That helps us know a little bit. And then we have archival records. I mentioned this to a few of you during the clinic about the archival records we hold at the museum. And this is an example of them. So this is a ledger page for Winchester's production ledgers. We're fortunate that when Winchester donated their firearms collection, they also gave their company archives to us, which included things about like company memos and HR complaints, if you believe it or not, in 1900, and all the things to these ledgers where they recorded detailed information about each firearm they made. And now at the museum, we host the manufacturing records for Winchester, Marlin, L.C. Smith, Ithaca, Savage, and A.H. Fox. Those companies, we hold all those records and currently total about 15.5 million serial numbers in those ledgers, in those various records. They're not all ledger form. Some of them are really oily, really actually kind of gross note cards that they left a little too close to the machinery. Now they're really hard to read. But we persevere as archivists and as historians, and that's how we learn a little bit beyond maybe what just Hollywood portrayed. One example of those records that we have is called Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham. They were a big wholesaler in the late 1800s. They got their start after the American Civil War. And at the end of the American Civil War, and I'll talk this a little bit more detail, basically the government offloaded all the surplus guns. Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham, Bannerman's, and other companies bought up all this surplus and resold it. And we are fortunate that we have in our archives the Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham records. And these are several examples of those. For those that are really good at reading 1800s cursive, you may pick up Houston, Texas. This one, also Houston. I picked out 3 that were Houston. I couldn't find any that were Beaumont specific. I tried, but Houston was kind of the nearest big shipping destination from stuff on the East Coast. And these are all orders for guns that shipped here within the 19th century. Actually, weirdly, they're all individual orders for a case of muskets. So a case of 20 muskets. When I'll talk about why that might be a little bit later. But this is a primary source document that shows us these guns came to this part of Texas at this time. And I believe, let's see the date. That one's dated 1889. I hid the date on that one. But I think that one's like 1895, and this one's 1894. So 1880s and 1890s. So the West compromises a really big range. So if you say we're going to talk about guns in the West, that can mean just about anything. And historians have long debated when's the opening and closing of the American West and the American frontier. And there's all sorts of arguments to be made about that. But for the purposes of our talk, we're going to talk about roughly Lewis and Clark to 1920. So that's probably a non-academic definition of the American West, but I think it'll work for this talk. And if you think about Lewis and Clark, they're some of the first European explorers to make that trip. Very famously, they make their expedition with the Corps of Discovery. And the guns that they take west are mostly these. So they take, at the time, the U.S. Model 1795, what we now call the Model 1795, what at the time was just called the Charleville pattern, named after the Charleville Arsenal in France, because during the American Revolution, the French sold us a lot of guns, and colloquially that became known among Continental soldiers as the Charleville, even though there were other arsenals that made the guns. And then that was so influential that when we started up Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the arms makers there just direct copied it. And then they called that the Charleville pattern gun. Later, we started calling it a Model 1795 to help us differentiate the different phases of production. But that was our first sort of standard issue long gun if you were a soldier in the early Republic. That's what you would have had. And because Lewis and Clark recruited soldiers to go with them on the expedition, it was a military expedition. The soldiers just brought the guns they were issued. So of the 30 or so folks on the expedition, most of them were U.S. military personnel, and they brought guns just like this one up here. Also very famously, Lewis and Clark carried something pretty unusual out west with them, and that's this down here. This is not the one. We get that question a lot at the museum. This is one like it. So this is a Giordoni air rifle, named for the inventor, Giordoni. Sometimes you'll see it as Girandoni, but the spelling that we can always find is Girardoni. And it is a magazine-fed air rifle, so there's a little tube that might be hard to pick up right there. And that tube holds 20 or 22 projectiles, and then the buttstock is actually an air reservoir. And so you pump that up, and then you get to shoot that magazine full of projectiles effectively as fast as you can recock that fake. It's not really a hammer because it doesn't hit anything, but everybody knew what a hammer looked like, so they made the cocking piece look like a hammer. And its effective range is 100, 150 yards. It carries enough energy to hunt with. It's quite a powerful firearm. People don't think of air rifles as being this early, but it was originally made for the Austrian military. They issued it to sharpshooters. And then Lewis and Clark, we're not sure how, but they saw one in Philadelphia and got their hands on it and took one with them. It's well documented that one went with them on the expedition. So a really unusual gun to take with them. There's not many surviving ones. Ours is a Russian-made example. They were mostly all made in Europe. The Austrian military used them for a little while and then got rid of them. They're kind of finicky, they're kind of complicated. And I don't know about you all, I don't really trust late 1700s manufacturing to hold what is an estimated 600 to 800 PSI. That's just me, you guys are braver. A fun trivia fact about that is it came with a hand pump. The hand pump took 1,500 cycles to fully charge that reservoir. So, you gotta really wanna shoot something. And that's a close-up of the lock, and you can actually see the Cyrillic alphabet on ours. Ours is made shortly after, probably about 10 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so we move forward, we'll jump forward in time to think about the classic American plains rifle. So Lewis and Clark, we think of 1806 on the Corps of Discovery. So we move forward into the mid-century, mid-1800s, and we think of that classic American Western rifle, the plains rifle, the mountain man rifle, the Hawken rifle. It takes its name from the Hawken brothers, Jacob and Samuel, who mostly worked in St. Louis, but they did work a few other places. They were gunsmiths. They learned the gunsmithing trade from their father, Christian Hawken, back near where I grew up in Western Maryland. And their whole family made guns, but they're without a doubt the most famous of the family to make guns. And they made rifles like this. So this one is a muzzle loading rifle. So for those unfamiliar with firearms, our muzzle end up here, our breech end back here. So you load your powder and your projectile down the barrel with the ramrod that's here under the barrel. These are percussion. They made flintlock and percussion. So this is a percussion cap gun, so it uses a copper cap with some priming compound in it. The very, very FDA-approved mercury fulminate was the compound they used at the time. And when that is impact sensitive, so when you pull the trigger and drop that hammer and it hits that copper cap, that mercury fulminate will detonate and cause ignite the charge you just loaded in the barrel. And this is the very classic Hawken mountain man shape profile. So it's got this big heavy barrel. The gun's about a 54 caliber. Mostly they made other caliber sizes, but most of them are 52 to 54. It has a half stock, so the wood stock only comes about halfway up the barrel. It's called a half stock generally. You'll notice on that musket I showed you earlier, it had a full length stock. The Hawkins also made full length stock guns, but they're much more better known for this style. And it's a percussion lock plate. And these are made late 1840s through the 1850s. The brothers then sell the shop, and a few people continue the name of the Hawkins shop. But undoubtedly, if you were headed west and you could afford it, this was the gun you wanted in those late 1840s. And in fact, the one on the bottom here, and I accidentally, when I formatted this, I have to apologize here, I cut off the top of the hammer there because I formatted these two pictures. But if you'll forgive me for that, this is a really cool gun because that is attributed to Jeremiah Johnson, who most people know as Robert Redford, but there was a real life guy. The line between Hollywood and real life gets blurred here. There was a real life Jeremiah or Johnston, and he was a mountain man. He's a very interesting Western character because of a few reasons. He serves in the Mexican-American War. Marries a Crow woman. She is murdered, and then he vows revenge, fights. This is the story. There's a lot of story to this guy. This is the story. But he vows revenge. He fights. He goes after the tribe that murdered her, and allegedly, when he kills one of the warriors from that tribe, he would eat their liver. It's probably not true, as most things. That's a big caveat in the American West. It's probably not true. But he then he explores a lot of the Rocky Mountains. That's what he probably is most famous for. He's up and down the Rockies. He's an early character, and unusually, he survives. He actually lives until 1900 when he dies in a veterans home in Los Angeles, which is not something you hear about for your Western characters very often. And then after the popularity of the movie, he was reinterred in Cody, Wyoming. So you can go to his gravesite today in Cody. He was sheriff in Red Lodge, Montana, which is just about an hour north of us. They were really happy with all the snow because there was a ski resort up there. We were less happy with it. But he was sheriff in Red Lodge, Montana, and Robert Redford was actually one of the pallbearers for the reinterment. But that is the rifle that that is documented to him. And one of the other features I should mention, almost all of the surviving Hawken rifles show a lot of really heavy use. And this is an example of the barrel marking. So we have S. Hawken for Samuel Hawken in St. Louis. So one of the things that most people think about with firearms in the American frontier is all these folks moving west. So you're on the East Coast, you take your American long rifle, you buy a Hawken, you take your ex-military gun, and you head out west and explore. But it's also important to remember that firearms are coming from both directions. We don't talk about the northwest part of the country at this time a lot, but there are active Russian traders in that area. And this is an example. This is a Russian musket that's in a museum collection in Dubois, Wyoming, which is it's actually about 50 miles as the crow flies, but it's like a 3.5 hour drive to get there because we don't have a road over that particular mountain. There is a horse trail, I think, but not a road. But this is a Russian musket in their collection. And so when we think about firearms, there's certainly a lot of guns going west, but there are also some actually coming east that get imported along the Pacific coast and sold to tribes there and then traded inland. And one thing to remember about all these guns, the guns actually travel faster than the settlement sometimes. So as European settlers arrive on the East Coast and Russian traders come down the Pacific coast, these guns, they're a trade good, effectively. So the tribe buys them, they trade for them, they ally with the French or the British or whoever, they get some guns, and then they use that as bargaining chips with tribes on the interior. So the guns and the goods, this is true for all the goods that were traded, actually advance ahead of a white and European settlement moving west, which is interesting to me. It's weird. It's actually a little bit like gossip. Bad news travels really quickly. The goods move faster than the people do, which is kind of interesting to think about. And this is an example of a gun that we wouldn't expect coming from the direction we also wouldn't expect. And it's been in that museum collection for quite a while, so it seems like one of those. And that's a close-up of the lock plate. The date there on that lock plate is very hard to read, but it's 1833. And I mentioned these trade guns. This is an example of a purpose-built trade gun. So the Russian gun there was a Russian military firearm that was imported or brought over. It was not really an import process in the 1800s, the way we think of it today, but this is a gun made specifically for trade with Native Americans. So there's all these purpose-built guns for different reasons. Native Americans began to favor certain styles of firearms for their hunting styles, for their purposes. And so, they had agency. They would tell the people trading to them, hey, we want a gun like this. That guy would write back to England or wherever the guns are being made and say, give it these features, that's what my customers want. And then they would ship a bunch of guns with those features. And this is the classic Northwest trade musket. So the general areas, there was a East Carolina style of musket, or Eastern and Carolina style of musket. And the Northwest trade one is the most famous of these trade muskets. And this one is basically as new. It's really unusual to see them like this because, again, they get issued, they get used, and they're out on the frontier, they get used up. This one is actually pretty late. So we think of flintlocks. This is a flintlock versus that percussion gun that came before the percussion guns. And we think of that as a really early 1800s technology, but actually lasted a lot longer on these trade guns because it was easier to get loose powder and flint on the frontier than it was to get other stuff. So we see these guns. This one is actually probably made as late as 1860. We're talking about early cartridges that are available by then, but we're still seeing these flintlock guns get made as new. This one is made in Birmingham, England, and shipped over. And that was a big production center for these trade guns. And they're usually featured on the lock plate. There's a little mark that you probably can't see, but but there's usually like a dog figure, very common, and usually the back of the lock plate has like a serpent on it. Those are very heavily associated with trade guns. Excuse me. So we made it through the Hawkins, we made it through these trade guns in the middle of the 1800s. And of course, there's a really big event in US history in the 1860s called the Civil War. And that kind of puts a pause, effectively, on Western expansion. All the resources of both sides are devoted to fighting the war. There's a little bit of skirmishing in the Rocky Mountain West, in the far western theater, but it's very limited. It doesn't have a huge impact on the war. What does have a big impact from the Civil War to the American West is that post-war era that I mentioned earlier. So these two guns here are Civil War cavalry carbines. So if you enlisted to fight in the Civil War and you happen to have your own horse already and had some experience, you might be able to get into the cavalry, and you were generally issued a carbine rather than the muzzle-loading muskets that most of the infantry got. And this is a Star carbine up here. This is a Merrill carbine. But the important thing to remember is they're both single-shot breech-loading carbines. So this one has a lever. You pull that lever down, it opens the breech of the firearm. You can insert a single cartridge in there, usually paper at this time, but not always. And the Merrill works differently. There's a little hinge plate up here. You pull that hinge plate backwards, and that exposes the breech. You insert your cartridge, close it, and fire it. That's much faster and much easier to handle on horseback than the big, long, muzzle-loading muskets that you've probably seen in the movies. We'll blame them for everything. And they tend to be issued to mounted troopers. But at the end of the Civil War, these guns all became surplus. So the Southern Army is completely disbanded, of course. The Union Army, the federal government says, we're going to allot the official strength at 25,000 at the end of the war. It had been over 1 million. So imagine shrinking the army by that much. We're talking 95% shrink, and the budget to go with it. They don't have any money. They don't need all the guns they have purchased during the war. So the government decides to sell those off as surplus. If you were a Union soldier, you had the chance to buy your gun on the way out of the service. And when whatever was left, they sold off as surplus to companies like Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham. And a lot of these guns are available. And in fact, they're available extremely cheaply. So there are records of some of these guns selling for as little as $1 or $2 at the time. And you think the comparable cost for a brand new Winchester that we'll see in a little bit is something like 30 or 35. And if you're trying to save up your money and have enough money to survive out in the West and buy other goods, that's a really strong value proposition that you have to weigh in the balance when that gun is that cheap. And it's still a pretty good gun. It might not be the best gun, but it's still pretty good. And $1 is real tempting. And again, that's also true of the handguns. So we saw that Colt that everybody aspired to on the movie poster. But again, these are the kind of handguns that you have available at the end of the Civil War that are also being sold as surplus and headed out west. So we have a Colt over here in the corner. We have this weird-looking contraption that is what was called a Savage Navy revolver. It's sort of a double action. For all the gun guys in the room, it's kind of a double action. This bottom lever here will cock the hammer, and the trigger then it's like two single action levers on the same gun, which is weird. But it was really unpopular among soldiers during the war, as was the one next to it. This gun here is a Joslin revolver. Troopers that got issued this compared it unfavorably to a bar of iron, but the government bought 2,000 of them and then sold those as surplus. And then this is another better like revolver called a Star double action revolver. So there's a lot of variety in the types of handguns and long guns, because during the Civil War, the government bought, on both sides of the conflict, bought as many different arms as they could. They were desperate for working firearms. So anybody that came to them with a song and an idea got a contract. Some of them were reliable, some of them weren't. And they bought a huge variety. So if you decide, hey, this guy's kind of interesting, and I really like what he said about the Civil War. I'm going to go collect Civil War carbines. Those sound cool. You have about 50 or 60 different types of gun to add to your collection in just Civil War era carbines. I'm not talking about handguns or the muskets or all that. There's a huge variety. It caused logistical problems during the war, but they were all very, very cheap at the end of the war. And like I said, it's a really strong value proposition. Maybe it's not the best gun, but it is a working gun, and sometimes that's all you need on the frontier. And as I said, there's surplus of all kinds. So this is another one of those records of Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham. This is a shipment out to Nebraska. It's got some muskets on it. I mentioned those muskets in the orders that I saw down here. So the Army was left with a lot of these. This is a model 1822. This is a smoothbore musket, meaning it does not have rifling in it. It's the older style of firearm. You're kind of unlucky if you got issued one of these in the Civil War. It's still muzzle loading, so powder projectile down here. There's no rifling to engage, so it's not a super accurate firearm. But they were used heavily in the Civil War, and what they tended to do was they converted them from flintlock. These are old flintlock muskets dating back to the earlier decades of the 1800s. They were so desperate for arms. If we can convert them to percussion, kind of standardize the ignition system, they'll work, we'll reissue them. Then after the Civil War, those are sold very, very cheaply. I mentioned $1 or $2 for the carbine. These are same kind of price range. And what a lot of people did with these is it's not a very effective military firearm by the end of the Civil War. In fact, it's a very ineffective military firearm by the end of the Civil War. But what it does make is it makes a really good single-shot shotgun. So you cut down the stock, you cut off the barrel, and then you have a gun that is still smoothbore because they never re-rifled them. And it's really cheap. You can buy the gun for $1, for a couple dollars. You can have the gunsmith lop off the barrel. And then you have a shotgun, and you can hunt small game with that. You can, in theory, do a little bit of self-defense if somebody comes on your property. But you have a gun that can hunt, that can shoot, that is functional, put a little bit of food on the table, and it is, again, extremely inexpensive. And then, of course, there are guns like the Spencer. This is one of the, again, one of those cavalry carbines sold during the Civil War. This one is actually a repeating one. So instead of being a single-shot breech loader, it has a magazine that's hidden here in the buttstock. And so it's a 7-shot. So you load 7 shots into that magazine. And then as you work this lever and hammer, you reload a shot from that magazine. And it was a highly prized gun, mostly only issued to Union cavalry during the war. But that was one that was also really inexpensive after a little bit more than this gun, this musket, but still very inexpensive at the end of the Civil War. The problem is, if you really wanted those, you had to act pretty fast. Those sold out pretty quickly, and there weren't as many available as there were of these. These are much more common. And in fact, the most numerous gun that we see in those Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham records are these muskets. So we don't see a lot of Winchesters. We don't see a ton of the other stuff. We see a lot of muskets by volume, which is really interesting. Most people don't expect that if you know a little bit about firearms in the American West and sort of what you're thinking of. And of course, I mentioned the Winchester. So if you wanted the latest and greatest, you wanted a lever action repeater like this. So this up here is a Henry. It has this very distinctive brass frame. There's no loading gate on it, and there's no forearm on it. This is the successor to the Henry. It does have a loading gate here, and it has a wooden forearm. These are to correct a couple of issues that users complained about with the Henry, but they both work essentially the same, which is this tube under the barrel is your magazine. You can load 14 shots into that, 14 cartridges into this magazine, and then it works as fast as you work this lever. The hammer, unlike on the Spencer that I just showed you, you have to actually work the lever and the hammer separately. So it's an extra step on the Spencer, and you have half as much ammunition. But on the Henry and Winchester, when you work the lever, the bolt also acts on the hammer to recock the gun for firing. And you can fire those 14 rounds as fast as you can do that, and some people can do that really, really quick. If you watch like high-level cowboy action shooters, this is a shooting sport today, they're very fast with that lever. But that was what if your budget wasn't a concern in your wagon train, and you wanted the best, you could spend about $35 or $40 depending on the rough time frame you talk about to get that model 1866 Winchester. And so it cost quite a bit, but was very effective. You could hunt with it. You know, a lot of people, if you ask today, the Henry's chambered in what's called 44 Henry, which is a rimfire cartridge. This is also in 44 Henry. The later 73 would be in 4440. 44 Henry is not what we would think of as a big game cartridge. You know, if you said, all right, I'm going to go out on one of these Wyoming hunting trips, I always hear about it. I'm taking 44 rimfire. Your guide is going to tell you you're not hunting anything. That's super unethical. We would never dream of it or anything equivalent. But people certainly did back in the Old West. I can't imagine how they did it, but there's certainly accounts of people like hunting bison with this, which is wild to think about. But they were still effective firearms. Obviously, they had a lot more potential for, say, self-defense or combat than that musket, that single-shot old musket that you might just be using to hunt small game. And of course, we got to talk about military firearms in the West. So a lot of people will you'll hear the Winchester is the gun that won the West. We'll talk about that in a second. But of course, one of the big presence of firearms in the West is the U.S. military. It shrunk down after the Civil War, and its main job went from fighting that war to policing the American frontier as the government made various treaties with Native American tribes as settlers moved west and encroached and did all the different things. There's obviously going to be periods of conflict. And there's quite a few skirmishes and battles between the U.S. military and Native Americans, and even at times settlers. And of course, the U.S. Army switches to a gun that looks a lot like the ones I showed you earlier from the U.S. military firearms. And there's a good reason for that, because it is very similar. And this is the what's called a first model Allen conversion trapdoor. The trapdoor Springfield became the standard issue U.S. military firearm after the war. And what they did is they took all those surplus muskets that they did keep, or all those the muskets that they did keep, and they converted them to breech loader. That was much more expedient and cost effective. Remember, there's no budget for the Army. There's only 25,000 soldiers. The budget's been slashed. They can't just order the latest and greatest in firearms technology. So they come up, a guy named Erskine Allen that works at the Armory. He comes up with a conversion where they cut out the breech of the old musket. They insert his design of a breech mechanism, and it takes it from that muzzle loader, which is sort of a slow, laborious process. It's about, they say if you were really good in the Civil War, you could get off 3 shots in a minute with that muzzle loading musket. But they take that, they convert it to that single shot breech loading, kind of like those carbines earlier. You open up the breech, slide in now a metallic cartridge instead of a paper one, close that, and you're ready to fire. So it's much quicker, it's much more easy to reload that gun. And that becomes the standard issue U.S. firearm for the next 30 years. So basically all of the plains wars that the U.S. Army fights, they do so with the trapdoor. Many of the trapdoors go with U.S. volunteers to the Spanish-American War as well. But that is the gun. If you think of the U.S. military in the West, you should be thinking of this gun. I've also put a Gatling gun here. This is one of our 2 Gatling guns in the collection. And of course, Gatling guns have been depicted a lot being used by the military in the American West. And there's a really famous debate about Custer. Should he take in the Gatling guns? Would that have saved him at the Battle of Little Bighorn? He did not have this model of Gatling gun available to him. He had, so the Gatling guns came in various different sizes. For those that don't know, the Gatling gun is a hand crank, rotary action, what some would call maybe a manual machine gun. Typically had 8 or 10 barrels in this time period, and fired as fast as you could keep ammunition fed and somebody could hand crank. There are accounts that they could achieve 600 rounds a minute with one. That takes a lot of physical effort to crank that quickly. So 400 or even 300 is probably a little more realistic. But nonetheless, 300 rounds a minute is a lot faster than even this gun. And of course, these come out originally in the Civil War. They see just a little bit of use. By the 1870s, they've developed the design a lot. It's now cartridge fed. It has a better feed mechanism. They've changed the gearing. If there's any like car guys in the room, you would love the inside of a Gatling gun because it's a lot of gearing to get the timing right. And they came in all different sizes. So they came in the standard Army caliber of 45-70. They came up into 1 inch. So 1 inch is basically small artillery, very large. and it's actually the 1-inch guns that Custer had available to him. The thing about having the bigger, heavier, nearly small artillery, it's also much heavier than even this gun. This gun, we can lift, and we had to lift it to get into that case. We can do it with 3 people, but it requires 3 people to lift that gun onto its mount in that case. And that's us being a little bit safe. If we had 2 really strong guys, maybe. But nonetheless, it's heavy. It takes weight. Custer was all about moving fast. And you'll note that nobody in the Army, when they blamed Custer for the defeat, complained that he didn't take the Gatling guns, because none of them would have made a different decision about the guns. The 1-inch guns were too big, they're too cumbersome. This is my editorializing about Custer. I don't know if you signed up for that or not, but they're just too big and too cumbersome. I think he made some other poor decisions, but I don't think this is one that is really illogical when he went and fought at Little Bighorn. And as a matter of fact, the Gatling gun is almost never fired in anger in the American West. So it's depicted a lot in movies because Hollywood loves it, because it's big, it's shiny, it's brash. It clearly means something when that shows up on screen. We all know what it means. So it's like the signifier that they love, but the historical record is that it was virtually never fired in anger, because most of the military commanders made the same decision as Custer throughout the West. This is too cumbersome. We're on the march for months at a time. I'm not lugging this thing through Yellowstone or wherever. And of course, there's some well-known icons we're fortunate to have in the museum. This is that same model of trapdoor. You'll notice it's missing a big chunk. And why would we, as a museum, keep such a rusty pile of garbage, if I can say so? It's because it's not really. This is a really important firearm to us. This happens to be the gun that Buffalo Bill William F. Cody earned his nickname with. So he was, one of the things I like to say about Cody is that he was both, he became so famous because he lived the experience of the American West and then told stories based on that experience. He wasn't just a dime novelist who was making up a story, and he wasn't one of those mountain men that couldn't communicate. And when they showed Buff back in town, everybody's like, oh, that guy smells, he's weird, I don't want to talk to him. He had a personality that could communicate, and he lived the experience. So he worked as a time for the Kansas Pacific Railroad, and he had a contract to hunt bison to feed the railroad workers. He always took a really ill view of market hunters later on. He viewed his work hunting to feed railroad workers as much more, or much less to blame for the loss of the bison population as he did as later hunts that really decimated the herds. But he's estimated to have killed at least, I think, something like 4,000 bison in his lifetime, or maybe more than that. The Buffalo Bill curator is going, if he sees this, sorry, Sam. But he used that hunting gun, and he used this particular rifle when he was active with the Kansas Pacific Railroad, and he kept it for the rest of his life. And he took it on a hunting trip with he often invited, as he became famous, European nobility would come over. They would see his show in Europe, and they'd be like, I want to go be a tough guy out in the West, and they would come over and they would hunt with him, and he would take them on these trips. And allegedly, on a hunting trip with Grand Duke Alexis of Russia, a horse stepped on the gun and broke off the stock. I think there's also a version of the story where one of them clubbed an elk with it, but the horse stepping on it seemed more plausible. And he even gave it a name, Lucretia Borgia, who was a character in an Italian play that he admired. Yeah, it's tough anymore without the stock, but it would have looked very similar to this originally. So this would have been the shoulder stock in your shoulder. Whoops, what's wrong with it? So the 73s. So we saw these early on in the presentation as the icons of the West, and I kind of gave Hollywood a hard time for making us think that these were the only guns available in the West. But there is some truth behind to them being available, despite the cost, and despite all the other options. The Winchester 1873 pictured up here, and the Colt 1873, generally called the Peacemaker or Single Action Army, both introduced in 1873, as the name would suggest. They become real staples of the American frontier. Winchester, over the course of this production, would make 724,000 Model 1873s. Colt would make about half as many, Colt single action army revolvers. So you're talking about over 1 million just in these two firearms that were heavily sold in the American West. So while they may have only ever used these two guns on the big screen, or very often use these two guns on the big screen, there was a little bit of truth. That's a lot of guns, that's a lot of manufacturing for that time period, for the population that's out west. The Winchester works like its older counterpart, the 1866. It's got a loading gate, magazine under the barrel here. The receiver is now steel instead of brass, and it's using centerfire 4440 and later 3840 and other cartridges instead of the weaker 44 rimfire. The Colt is also available in that 4440, so you can have the same ammunition. It's available in 45 Colt. It's a 6-shot cartridge revolver. So you open your loading gate that's just on the side here. You can insert a cartridge. There is one downside to the Colt that continues to the present day. If you own a Colt single action, this is a safety briefing, because it's often called a 6-shooter, but the practice was not to carry 6 rounds, because the firing pin on this hammer, when you have it fully loaded, rests on the primer of the cartridge. So you've loaded your 6 rounds, you're on your horse, your leg's over the side, your holster's at your leg, you're bouncing around, gun in the leg, round in the leg, and you shoot yourself. It's also not drop safe, so if you pull the gun out of the holster and you drop it, it's going to go off. So the standard practice was to leave one chamber empty and to then lower the hammer on the empty chamber, so you had 5 shots ready to go, and didn't have a dangerous situation ready to go off the holster. There are occasionally reports, believe it or not, because you can get both reproductions and originals of these still, and some of the reproductions do not have a modern transfer bar safety, so that's how most of the modern ones overcome this. And I think there was a court case like 3 years ago where a guy was on an ATV with one of these, fell off the ATV, and that shot him in the leg because he had all 6 chambers loaded. So it's still surprisingly occasionally a problem in the American West. Just ATVs, not horses, I guess. Another classic one is the stagecoach gun. This is what we think of, short barrel shotgun, used by companies like Adams Express and American Express. And I've always thought their slogan worked pretty well, both in recently and in the 1880s, don't leave home without it. It is the same American Express that we think of today. And this is a Winchester Model 1887 shotgun that we have in our collection that is actually documented as sold to American Express. So coach guns are pretty heavily faked. So any old shotgun in a lot of people's minds is a coach gun because it increases the value, increases the story and the lore. This one is documented in those factory records that I mentioned as being sold to American Express, and it's really hard to see on a screen, but it does say Amex Co. on the side of that gun, which is a pretty neat connection. I'm sorry, I'm going to speed up a little because I think I'm a little long for time, so if I go too fast, please ask questions during that time. This is another interesting concept to me. This is another Winchester. This is a model 1894, and the reason I added this to the slideshow is because this is a gun from the American West. So this is a Winchester designed by John Moses Browning. John Browning is one of the most famous U.S. gun designers, and he was prolific. He worked with Winchester beginning in the 1880s and would do so until 1900. Went on to work with other companies, has something like 130 or 140 firearms patents. One of his most famous and best-selling is the Winchester Model 1894. This is an ad the year it came out, so you can see the prices there for a new 94 back then. But he lived and worked in Ogden, Utah. So he was inventing guns in the American West. Winchester would buy up his inventions, make them in their factory, and then sell them back in the American West. So this one's kind of crisscrossing, but it's interesting to me that this gun has its origins in the American West. The designer who came up with this idea, he knew the West, he hunted out West, he shot out West. He lived that experience and designed a gun that then also became associated with the place. And what wasn't out West? I say nearly nothing here because a lot of guns make it. So this is an ad for a Colt, what we would call a semi-automatic pistol. The ad calls it an automatic Colt pistol. There's also, they actually occasionally refer to these as revolvers because the terminology wasn't settled back then. But believe it or not, Cody was founded as a town pretty late by Buffalo Bill. It was sort of founded to be a tourism town. That's what he wanted for it. We did have one notable gunfight, one good old-fashioned Western gunfight A couple of robbers hopped into the bank. The building's still there today. It just changed ownership. It was a jewelry store across from the very famous Irma Hotel. So they run into the bank, they steal the money. They unfortunately shoot and murder one of the tellers. On trying to make their getaway, they hop out. People in the Irma Hotel see this commotion. It's filled with all sorts of Western characters that you might associate with Buffalo Bill. A shootout ensues. There's an exchange of gunfire. A bullet gets lodged in a painting that was then hanging in the Irma and is actually now in our museum, and the bullet is still in the painting. The newspaper accounts in Cody all describe automatic pistols as what the two guys were shooting with. So weirdly enough, it was very likely an early Colt semi-automatic handgun like this that was involved in Cody's most famous shootout. And that was in early 1900s. I want to say like 1906 or something like that. So just after the turn of the century, and kind of an unusual thing. The robbers, it was actually it made national news because here's this Western figure with his town. He's gonna, what's he going to do about these guys? And he makes the show of forming a posse and going after them, but the robbers were never found. And they made it away. And then I want to talk just real briefly, and I'll try and zoom through these because I know I'm a little long on time, but the classic Old West bolt action. We don't think of that one. This is a Remington Keen. This is chambered in 4570, that standard government trial. They competed with us for government contracts. The most famous one they won for our purposes was with Indian Agency Police was the term. But basically Native Americans that were acting as police within their own tribes were actually issued these guns to perform their police duties, as that was the firearm they used. So these show up a lot in photos with Native Americans, somewhat surprisingly. And it's a bolt action. We don't think it was a bolt action as a gun that's in the West a lot. We think of the lever action. So it's a little bit different of what we think about, but it is definitely being used in the American West. And what I call tourist patrol in Yellowstone, obviously my job depends on tourism, so I have to say nice things when you guys come and visit. But there was certainly a need then and now for people to be on their best behavior and follow some of the rules in the park. And I don't know if anybody can see this that well and recognize the profile, and you can just barely see it on this horse in this photo. But these are two photos from the area around Mammoth Hot Springs on the north end of Yellowstone. You can go some of these buildings that you can see here, not this hotel, but their original buildings still there. When Yellowstone opened as a park, it opened in 1872. I'll ask you guys a question. Anybody know when the Park Service was founded? 1916. So that leaves us a pretty big gap of no park rangers. So the way the government managed the park is they sent military units out to the Army garrisoned the park and did police duty in the park. And the Army just brought whatever guns they had with them. So the unit that was assigned the park that year just brought their guns. So there's trapdoors, there's Springfields, there's all sorts of stuff. You can find photos of Gatling guns. And after the turn of the century, the U.S. Army began experimenting with these newfangled belt-fed, gas-operated, recoil-operated, water-cooled, air-cooled, all the different machine guns that were coming out. This is a Colt-built Maxim gun. So the Colt made a handful of Maxim guns. The inventor Hiram Maxim, a U.S. inventor that would sell his invention to both the UK and to Germany and make some of the guns under license with Colt. It would be famously used in the trenches of World War I to cause an immense amount of death and destruction. Became famous for the stalemate in that war because of these new machine guns. And this is a group of U.S. Army soldiers in Yellowstone. They're doing their job to keep the tourists from petting the bison. And if you pet the bison, that looks to be about a 250 round belt. So good luck. But you see a lot of weird photos of whatever the Army, because that was a big experimental phase. They're trying all these new technologies at the turn of the century, and they're rotating through the park until 1916. So a lot of the weird guns they have show up in photos of them on garrison duty in the park. I mentioned the automatics already, but this one is a C96, another gun we associate with World War I. It was actually introduced in the late 1890s, as the 96 might imply, and it is marketed. This is a U.S. print ad for this gun, imported from this dealer in New York City, and no other weapon will command the same wholesome respect among the lawless, and as a burglary violence or riot preventer, there is nothing like it. So clearly a gun meant to market towards self-defense and the lawlessness, and there's a lot of Western themes in this ad. And it was sold out west. And in fact, this photo is of Texas Rangers in 1903, and this gentleman right here has one in his hands. So, a C96 as used and endorsed by at least one Texas Ranger. We all associate the Texas Rangers with the American West, but we don't associate Mauser pistols with the American West. But there's certainly one in that photo. And this is that original photo. You see all the classic holsters and revolvers and lever action. There's a 73 right there. And then just across the back here is the distinctive wood holster that goes with the C96. So that can't be anything but the C96 Mauser. And these guys are in Oklahoma. So it's at least two photos of C96s, that ad paying off, and Mauser selling a couple to guys in the West, doing what would appear by, I think, anybody's standard, academic or otherwise, very Western things, or looking like they're about to do very Western things. This is another local example from our collection. This is, I mentioned Cody's found it kind of late as a tourist town. It's not really the classic Western town, but the one thing it shared with other Western towns was prostitution. And this gun belonged to Cassie Waters, who's kind of a local hero in Cody. She started a lot of local businesses, put a lot of early funding to the town, and of course one of her businesses was running a series of brothels in Cody. Cassie's Supper Club, if you've been to Cody, is actually on the site of one of her brothels. But she became very successful at that particular business. She had several suitors in town. We don't know which one gave her this gun to her, but it is inscribed, to my friend Cassie, every inch a lady. Very suggestive. It is gold plated and has a mother of pearl handle. The guy who's the leading candidate that gave her this gun, a guy by the name of Dr. Bennett, he got ran out of town after Cassie and his wife showed up to the same store wearing the same dress, which I don't want to encourage any illicit behavior, but that's a pretty rookie move. This is a photo. This is William F. Cody standing here just outside of Cody. So if you go into Yellowstone via Cody, you'll go past the place called Pahaska Teepee. This is a hunting camp just above Pahaska Teepee that Cody really liked. And there's all sorts of Cody's friends and show personnel out here relaxing after a show season, going hunting. There's both white and Native American performers. And I didn't think much about this photo because it just has all the guns we've already talked about until I noticed and looked closely that this Native performer here is holding a really unusual gun for the American West. There's a couple of examples. This is a Winchester over here. I think this is another Winchester, so two guys holding those. There's William F. Cody. He's holding a rifle over his shoulder. We still have that rifle in the museum. And then there's this photo. And this gun with a really distinctive profile, a nose cap that you can just see up by this gentleman's ear, and a magazine right here. And that magazine is the giveaway. That is either a Spanish or Argentinian Mauser cavalry carbine. And the photo was taken in 1901. Those carbines were introduced in 1891. And there's not a lot of ways to imagine how a gun either used by the Spanish or Argentinians made it into the hands of a native performer of Buffalo Bill's Wild West in northwest Wyoming just a few years later. That's a weird way to get to that gun. It makes a lot of sense. It's short, it's light, they're in timber, it'd be a great hunting gun. I get why he chose it, but how he got it, we don't know. There's a possibility that after the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, some of the Spanish carbines came into the country. The earliest ad I can find selling those, though, is 1903. The other possibility is that Cody recruited heavily from South American performers, so perhaps one of those guys brought it up from the Argentinian contract. These were made in Germany for those two militaries. It's a really weird gun to see. And it's even weirder than the Mauser pistol, because at least we know there's an ad for the Mauser. It appears in print. We know they're trying to sell them over here, so it's imaginable somebody could order them. There's no ads for this. It's not in the commercial chain. It's a military-only kind of gun. And here it is hunting just a few miles from where the museum is today. So I hope you enjoyed that look, and I hope I didn't go too far over, but I hope you enjoyed that look at the variety of firearms in the American West. These are, the reason I'm passionate about this subject and enjoy studying this subject there's of course a lot we could say about firearms in today's climate, but these were everyday items. People lived with, experienced, needed, and used these items. When you're thinking about the past, whether it's a gun, whether it's clothing, whether it's a saddle or a wagon, the stuff that was there is a key primary source for what was it like to be there. That's why I'm passionate about museums. That's why I love it. It's because I get to handle and look and study the stuff that was there. I can't talk to the people; they're all long gone. But I get to experience and learn from the stuff that was there, and I really enjoy that and really enjoyed sharing that with you. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take some questions. Yes, sir.
Have you seen and who owns Tom Horn's rifles?
That's a great question. For those that didn't hear, have I seen and do I know who owns Tom Horn's rifle? I'm hoping you're about to hit me with a bombshell revelation because I don't know.
I wish I owned it.
For those that don't know, Tom Horn, he's a Wyoming and sort of Western figure that's involved in a number of things, but most notably, I think, for a shootout and a murder and then imprisonment during the cattle wars in Wyoming. And he had a Winchester rifle. And I don't know if the rifle is known. I'm not sure. I have to look that. I don't believe it's not. To my knowledge, it is not known where that rifle is today.
The only thing I can find on the internet is that it's privately owned, and they won't say who.
Yeah, there's a few of those floating around. I've heard tale of Butch Cassidy's gun floating around Wyoming, and nobody will say who. But yeah, I'd love to know. I was hoping it would be you. Yes, sir. In fact,
You mentioned the long guns. How long were those guns, and when did they get shortened, like the original ones?
yeah. So those the long guns that got shortened. A musket. Muskets were made for a very specific kind of warfare. So those long infantry muskets that I mentioned, they are made to be fired in rank. That's one of the reasons they're so long, is so that the guy behind you doesn't hit you. And you can fire in ranks that way. They're also made that long because when you put the bayonet on the end of them, then you have an effective weapon to hold off a cavalry charge. So there's a couple of reasons for that. A general rule of thumb is about 5 feet. So without a bayonet, it's up to my shoulder. With a bayonet, it's taller than I am. And you take that in the fact that I am much taller than a person from that time period. So a Civil War soldier is probably 5'4", 5'5". On a good day, they probably weigh 130, 140. One of the things that if you get into the material culture study of textiles or the past, you'll find clothing, you'll be like, oh, that's kids' clothing. It's almost always adult clothing. They were just a lot smaller. And so imagine somebody who's 5'5", carrying a musket and bayonet and marching around and fighting, and it's taller than I am. So it's kind of weird to think about. When they shortened them down, they tended to shorten them, say, roughly half the length. So they tended to shorten them quite a bit. Yes, ma'am.
Just a small personal question. My mother's favorite gun was a .22, very short thumb trigger. How did they end up making thumb triggers?
Well, they didn't have lawyers or safety regulations. No, the thumb trigger it's an interesting rifle. So Winchester came out with a rifle that was called a thumb trigger, and it's sort of like a bolt action, but there's no trigger, and you push on the back of the bolt. That's your trigger. They were marketed sort of oddly enough as like kids rifles, small game rifles. They're really inexpensive. So if the kid takes it out in the woods and beats it up and it doesn't come back, you haven't lost your investment. Why they went that particular route, I can't tell you. But it was done to probably to keep the gun as inexpensive as possible, given that they were marketing it as sort of a really cheap hunting gun or target gun.
Shoot on it, and she said the way they taught them to shoot when she was a child, she was born in 24, was you found on a windy day and you had to shoot pine cones out of the tree in the wind.
That's a better shot than I am.
My brother was furious because he was a marksman in the military, and my mother could outshoot him every day.
I bet if you had a pine cone come out of the tree, you'd be a pretty good shot. And interestingly, I didn't focus on this aspect of it in the talk, but today we sort of think we all say, oh, it's gun guys, or it's when people come to visit, we'll send dad in the museum. We're going to look at the art museum, that kind of thing. At the time we're talking about, if you go back and look at period photographs, there are an absolute huge amount of female hunters, shooters. They're pictured on the frontier with their firearms. This is not necessarily just the gun guy thing to do in the Old West. It is really, really common to see photos of female homesteaders and other figures out west with their guns. So probably at a higher percentage than we would think of today.
Any other questions?
In the back?
So this is actually Lucy's question.
Okay.
She's just embarrassed to ask. There's a bunch of, just so you know, a bunch of 4-H shooting club people here in the audience. And they use hand stops when they're shooting. And she wants to know, when did stops start being put on guns?
That's a great question. They're a much more recent kind of invention. You start to see things that are vaguely like it by the late 1800s, but it's really uncommon, and it's usually like some shaping to the end of like the forestock. And I think just to give you a little bit, it won't actually stop you from reaching forward, but it will give you a little bit of a tactile sensation if you're looking down the sight that you're getting to the end of the stock. You don't really see what we would call a hand stop until after World War II. So you see some foregrips in sort of the military firearms, but that's not really what, that's a different purpose. And you don't see some of those hand stops until after the war with sporting and target guns. So it's a pretty recent invention in history terms. So, great question. I think I saw one other.
Sarah, were there any functional reasons for the design of the octagonal barrel?
Probably the most function they got out of it is it ended up being a little bit heavier weight in terms of manufacturing process. And at the time, so those octagonal barrels of those flat sides that you saw on the Hawken, versus a round barrel, the typical way you see a barrel today, which is just a regular circle. The octagonal ones end up being a little bit heavier. And at the time, they probably didn't know why, but they certainly did recognize that heavier barrels were more accurate. The reason is because the increased weight of the barrel, it increases the stiffness. So if you shoot a barrel under a high speed, or you fire a gun under a high speed camera with modern technology at very high frame rates, you'll see the barrel flexes, and that flex has an impact on the repeatability and thus the accuracy of each shot. So if you increase the barrel thickness, as you do that makes it more rigid. The thicker the barrel, the more rigid, and it's a scale, and it happens to make it more accurate. It's easier to repeat the shot each time if the barrel's not flexing. So they certainly had a recognition of that fact. That's why the Hawkins had heavy barrels. They knew that was more accurate. They didn't have the high-speed camera to know that, and the octagonal barrels probably happened to be more accurate and thus a little bit preferred because there's a little more weight to them. But yeah, that's the rough answer, is that they sort of stumbled upon accuracy.
Why do we have octagonal barrels today?
Because you can get heavy barreled guns in a round barrel. That's certainly present today, and the manufacturing capability and the accuracy capability of even the round barrels is very, very good today. So
It's not the geometry of the octagon. It's
No.
constant.
correct. It's the weight of the barrel walls. It's the thickness and the weight of the barrel wall specifically, whether it's octagon or round. And the way they made octagonal barrels back then happened to make them heavier than the round ones. Although you do see from the time period heavy round barrels too. Sort of, it's a little bit all over the place, but.
I have a question.
I got one up here and then we'll get to you. Okay.
Logistically, prevalence of ammunition at that time in the West, was it difficult to obtain that? I mean, how did they just figure it out the same way with supplies and anything else? Or did they do any reloading? How did they handle that?
Sure, that's a really good question. So the way they got ammunition in the West and the availability is it's sort of in two phases. There's the pre-Continental Railroad and there's the post. Pre, it's pretty difficult. That's why we see flintlocks stick around because you might not have a regular supply of cartridges. But the West develops an infrastructure. Again, we're used to that scene of some remote, dusty town, and the train's not coming for, a month, and the wagon is late, and we have that mental picture that everything was hard to get in the West. But this is also the time period when, Sears is shipping entire houses, and you went and picked it up at the railhead and you built it. So certainly once the railroad comes in, ammunition's pretty easy to get. It's not, it's actually not that dissimilar today. They had catalogs you could order. The Mauser ad came from a gun magazine in the time period. And so you would get a circular, and it would list prices. You would write them a note, send them a telegraph, and 2 or 3 weeks later, once they got it, the ammo shows up at the depot and you go pick it up. It's not quite Amazon Prime, but given the alternative, it's pretty good. Before that, though, it can be quite difficult. And then, of course, this is also the era when reloading does start to happen, and there are certain figures, certain hunters especially tend to prefer that. It seems like there's a well-known hunter from our area, a guy named Pickett, and he almost exclusively hand-loaded ammunition. But again, he was getting those supplies by rail just like everybody else was getting ammunition. So it's probably a little easier to get than we think. That's what would happen for that guy, that Texas Ranger that had the Mauser. He would have written a letter. He would have seen that circular. He would have wrote a letter back to the dealer in New York. The dealer shipped it to him. Pretty straightforward, even if it's not what we normally think of. He might have even telegraphed it. It might have been there. I don't know. It might have gotten there faster than I did. My Amazon Prime in Cody is like 7 days.
Any more questions?
I've got one question.
I see 1 and then 2, and I think we better wrap for time. But
Yeah,
yes, sir.
would you say something about rifling and the importance of that and accuracy
Sure.
and when it came about?
Yeah. So the questions about rifling, I didn't really get into the technical aspects of this, but we talked about a lot of rifled firearms. So the earliest guns, that 1795 musket, those old muskets that they were using in the Civil War, those are all what we call smooth bore, meaning the inside of the barrel is smooth. There's no grooves. There's nothing in there to act on the bullet. They shoot a round ball, and there's typically, when they're loaded, there's a lot of windage. What the technical term is windage, but there's just a lot of gap on either side, depending on the evenness of the projectile and a number of other factors. That is the most common way to make a firearm from when firearms emerge until about the 1800s or middle of the 1800s. And so smooth bores, because they have nothing acting on the projectile, they're mostly reliant on velocity to keep accuracy. Not all of them are that high velocity, and they're accurate to roughly man-sized target at 100 yards is normally what you hear, because it comes up in Rev War and Civil War talks. A little bit further, a little bit less, depending on conditions and the ability of the shooter. But 100 yards is the rough estimate for accuracy on those, and it's not going to be super repeatable. You're not going to have the bullseye shooter group today is going to all be in the 10 ring. You're going to be hoping to stay on paper every shot at 100 yards. Rifling is a really old technology. A lot of people don't think about that. Rifling is the grooves cut into a barrel. Those grooves have a twist as they go down the barrel, and that twist spins the projectile, and that spin stabilizes it in flight, and that imparts accuracy. So the earliest rifles increase the accuracy to 200 or 300 yards. By the time of the American West, there are shooting competitions at 1,000 yards, 2,000 yards, stuff like that. So it's dicey to shoot black powder that far because the velocity is still pretty low, but people were doing incredibly long range. The famous Creedmoor matches were 1,200 yards. That was in the 1870s, I believe. So the rifling is what gives the projectiles the increased accuracy. And it's actually, in this time period for black powder firearms, which is what we're mostly talking about, the twist is actually really slow. People think it's super fast. Like the Hawken, for example, would not complete a full twist in the length of the barrel. So it's a relatively slow spin for those firearms. So I think,
You mentioned the gather bill,
Mhm.
and you said that they had some of them that were actually in the Civil War.
yes,
What in the world caliber were they then?
they were 58 caliber, and they used really weird inserts with a percussion cap on the back. So basically, they took sections of barrel, put a percussion cap on the back of it and loaded it like they would a musket, and then they fed those into the mechanism. It's sort of what we might call a proto cartridge or something like that. It's not quite a cartridge, but it's almost there.
Well, it's a pretty good time thing between 73 and 65.
Mm-hmm.
That was 8 years
Mhm.
before we actually had a 45.
Mhm.
So that was kind of a dead area for the Gatling gun?
Well, they were still using them, and at the very end of the war, the very next model, they used 5070, which is sort of the predecessor to the 4570, and that was available by 66. So they had a metallic cartridge version really quickly after the war, but the very, very first guns were that sort of quasi-cartridge.
Well, Danny, we cannot thank you enough. We're blown away by the amount of fabulous information you've shared with us tonight, and we thank you so much for being trip home. But I thank you all for coming tonight. It's a pleasure to have you here and an honor to have you here at the McFaddin-Ward House. We hope you'll come again and enjoy our programming, and you all have a safe night. Thank you.